So, some of the people that we wanted to talk to us weren't able to be here, but they were happy for a small part of their thinking to be captured on video. So first up is Lucy Crehan, best described as an education explorer. Having taught in the UK for 3 years and completed a Master's in Education at Cambridge, Lucy set out to work in schools and live with teachers in top-performing education systems around the world. We've captured some of her thoughts on questioning styles from a few of those countries.
When I was in China, I did notice that the way in which teachers ask questions, so you had those kind of closed yes, no, single answer questions, but you also had some really open or in-depth questions. And that won't surprise anyone, that's just good teaching practice. Teachers do that in England as well. The difference, I think, was when you use those different sorts of questions. So in the first couple of grades, teachers will do quite a lot of closed questioning, children will do quite a lot of memorization of number facts. And that's important. Research has shown that memorizing certain key components of any discipline is really important. What they also did, though, when children got a little bit older in the next couple of years, was really ask more in-depth questions, more open questions, to get children to make connections between different parts of the subject. A student might give an answer to a question, fairly straightforward question that the teacher has asked, to some kind of closed question. If they got it wrong, all right, to be honest, the teacher, rather than just moving on and saying yes or no, would ask often another follow-up question to that student. So they might say, okay, that's interesting. What strategy did you use, or how did you get that? And then not only building on that answer with that student, but then asking a different student in the class, oh, how did you do it? Do you agree? What different strategies did you use to get this same answer? So in that way, really getting students to think more deeply about the ways in which they were coming up with particular answers. Research comparing Chinese and American teachers has shown that Chinese teachers are much more likely to ask follow-up questions when a student gets something wrong, rather than saying, no, that's not right, or good try, and telling the student the answer. That's actually really important for learning, because then not only does the student know that they've got the answer right or wrong, but they understand why they got the answer right or wrong. Many people think that in Finland it's all about student group work and student-led learning. And actually, surprisingly, in Finland the teachers do quite a lot of whole class teaching. But the way in which they do that is quite interesting, because it's certainly not the teacher standing at the front just talking for the whole lesson. It is reasonably teacher-centred, but the teacher will ask a lot of questions and generate a class discussion. So again, it's not just about the teacher asking a student a question and the student responding. It's about the teacher taking a student's response and actually asking other students to build on that, leading into a whole class conversation. So another great practice in questioning I noticed in my studies abroad is the way in which teachers used what we in England call hinge questions. So that's the use of a question at a certain point in the lesson to try and get a sense of what the students have understood, what their misconceptions are, so they know at that point in time whether to carry on with a certain topic or address a misconception, or whether actually most of the class have got it and they can move on. The crafting of these questions is really important. Getting a question where if a student gets the answer right, you know that it's because they have understood that concept, rather than just they haven't understood it but they could still by chance get it right. So the kind of questioning that teachers are using in Finland is always genuinely to get a sense of, have the students understood it? Where are they? It's entirely for learning, because the summative piece is done by the teacher themselves. And that is actually, the kind of questions which are formative are helping the teachers to have an understanding of where the student is, helping them get as far as they can before they have to give them an overall assessment or test. In a study by Stigler and Stevenson, this is back some years ago now, they went into Japan and they looked at the practice of lesson study, which is where a number of teachers come together to plan a lesson together. And they said, well, what do you spend all of that time talking about? And one of the teachers said, well, we spent a lot of time thinking about what question to ask, because the right question can really get students thinking about a subject, or the right question can really get us to understand where students have gone wrong. And that is such a powerful tool. So it's not the case that a single teacher's coming up with it. It's a group of teachers, or it's a question. In Singapore, for example, they have teachers' guides, and it'll be a question in the teacher's guide, which has previously been thought of meticulously and thought about and discussed by expert teachers. The ideal amongst Japanese teachers is to start the lesson with some kind of problem that they ask the students. So they might have a number of different glass containers, different shapes and sizes on the table, and the question will be, how can we tell which one holds the most water? And then the reason that they do that is to use that as a hook, so to get the students interested in, I don't know. We'll have to find out, what will be a different way to find out? And then the teacher can lead a whole sequence of questions and practicals potentially on the idea of measurements or the idea of volume. At a secondary level though, in year 9 in Japan, they are much more likely to be asking questions that are in those final assessments and giving feedback such as, learn this, it's in the exam. One study that I think is interesting that looks at these cross-cultural comparisons in questioning is between Chinese teachers and American teachers. And what they showed was that when a student gets an answer wrong, teachers respond in different ways, typically, in general, in these two places. So American teachers are more likely to say yes or no, and then move on, whereas Chinese teachers are much more likely to ask a follow-up question to that same student, asking, how did you get that, for example. Interestingly though, that wasn't the case uniformly with all Chinese teachers, of course. The pattern was that more experienced teachers were more likely to ask that follow-up question. So it was the more expert teachers doing that. And I think that point about it being expert teachers is really important, but not how you might think. So it's not the case that if you're not an expert teacher yet, well, hang on, you'll be good at questioning in 10 years. Because what these countries are also doing is learning within the profession from each other. You can bring in some expert questions that were designed by expert teachers into a lesson as a first-year teacher, if you've met with a group of teachers to plan a lesson together and to come up with those questions together.